Hi, this is Julie from Prairie Point Junction Quilt Shop in Cozad, Nebraska. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'd like to show you our Farm Girl vintage quilt that we're working on as one of our Saturday sampler quilts for this year. This project is from the Farm Girl Vintage 2 book by Lori Holt, and one of the versions that she has is this sampler quilt, but then she also has a version listed called her Busy Bee Flower Farm Sampler. And so we've taken that quilt and we've actually changed it up a little bit with the blocks that are featured. Her quilt, if you can see, actually had just flower blocks on there. But we changed things up and we used a variety of her sampler blocks that are in the book and created this version that has a little bit more of a farm and garden feel to it. So we do have complete kits available for this project. If you're just joining us and want to jump in, we can sure get you set up with that as well. So the second Saturday of each month, we do a Saturday sampler demo on some of the blocks for the quilt. So this is our April demo for the April blocks. And we are going to be starting with the Barn Cat block. And the Barn Cat is going to be a 12-inch block, and it's found on page 17 in your Farm Girl Vintage 2 book. Now you always want to pay attention because in this book, what's wonderful is she's got both a 6-inch and a 12-inch set of directions for each block. So when you're making the sampler quilt, you want to be sure we're using both sizes of blocks throughout the program. So you want to be sure that you're making the correct size block for this particular block. So we're doing the 12-inch version of the cat. And so once again, it's on page 17 in your book. And some tips that I have for you for this particular block are you just want to make sure that you have your background pieces in particular turned the right direction. There's a lot of pieces that are fairly similar in size of length versus width. So you want to make sure that you have those oriented the correct way. One of the tips on page 19, if you're following along, piece M is the back of the cat here. And you're going to add a corner square piece of your background fabric to the back of your cat. So when you're aligning that piece, it's 2 1/4 by 2 1/2 inches. So it's real easy to get that turned. So when you're laying it out, you want to make sure that that piece is 2 1/2 inches tall and 2 1/4 inches wide. And I hope I gave you the right measurements for that and not the measurements for the 6-inch block, but you'll adjust accordingly if that wasn't the right measurement there. Just make sure that your piece is taller than it is wide for that particular section. Otherwise, I think the directions are pretty straightforward for that particular block. Once you have it pieced, a fun part is you can add a little embellishment. If you look over here in the quilt, Barb has added a little bit of embroidery to that block for its whiskers and its nose. Now the cat will actually get little buttons sewn on for the eyes, but I recommend that you don't sew the buttons on until after your quilt has been machine quilted, so that those buttons don't get caught or throw the timing off of your machine quilter's machine. So go ahead and add the embroidery, but hold off on adding any buttons to that block. So the second 12-inch block that we're going to make is our Tending the Garden block. And the Tending Garden is once again 12 inches as well, and it starts on page 131 in the book. Now I think the trickiest part of this particular block was doing the spout on the watering can, because once again your background pieces are very similar in size for length compared to the width. So make sure that when you're following along in your book that you're making sure that those are aligned in the correct direction before you sew them together. And I think an interesting little sewing trick for the little spout right here is you're actually making a half square triangle, and then you're adding a square, a little corner square technique, onto the corner of that half square triangle unit. So that's just a little bit different technique, but it's what gives you that cute little plaid design on the top of your spout. And I think the other thing you'll want to be careful for when you're sewing this particular block is right here on your little flower. You need to be careful, and this would be a great place to have those pieces lined up on one of your little design boards. You'll see that each of those 4 flower sections have a different combination of pieces sewn on the corner. So the top of your flower unit uses your background fabric and a little yellow center to make those 2 units. And then the bottom unit, you've got a background fabric, your yellow center, and a little piece of green for the corner of your stem. So you'll just want to make sure that you have those oriented correctly before you begin to sew those on. Otherwise, once again, the directions in the book are very clear, step-by-step color pictures all the way as you go. Just make sure you pay attention to the orientation of your squares, and when you sew your little flower together, to make sure that the proper colors are on the proper corners of your block. So that's our 12-inch blocks. And now for our 6-inch blocks, we have the Curious Crow, and he is on page 38 in your book. And he's got some teeny tiny little pieces for his little feet. But once again, they're all just corner square triangles, the same technique that you've been doing as we've been going along. I think one of the interesting techniques of this block is when you make this section of the crow, you're going to assemble the pieces as I have them shown here, but to get the back of the crow, you're going to take a square of background fabric, draw a line diagonally down the center of that, and then you're going to position that over the top of the block section that you just pieced. You're going to sew diagonally down that center line, trim your 1/4 inch seam allowance off, and then when you fold and press that, that is what makes the back of your crow. So very simple to do, but just kind of an interesting technique where you've sewn everything together and then you're going to sew your corner square at the very end of that. So that's our tips for your little crow. And for your crow, if you'd like, you could do a little French knot for his eye, or you could do a button as well. But remember, if you're adding the buttons, make sure you wait to add those on until after you have had your quilt machine quilted. And then our final block for the month is the Starry Nights block, and you'll find that on page 126 in the book. And this is another 6-inch block. So they're very tiny little pieces, but it's very straightforward piecing. You're actually making a little flying geese unit for the points of your stars, but they're also just a corner square kind of triangle technique where you'll be drawing your diagonal line, stitching, pressing that open, and then putting your other corner on, drawing your diagonal line, trimming your seam allowance, and pressing that open. And then you'll sew 3 sections of those together to make your stars. If you picked up one of the corner clipper rulers last time from Creative Grids, these are a great place once again to use that ruler to trim your pieces before you stitch. It's just another way of approaching sewing those blocks. So once again, blocks are pretty straightforward, all mostly corner square triangles. The most important part always is to make sure that you're sewing the right size blocks. And so those of you that are new, that are joining us, as I mentioned, we do have complete kits available, and I just wanted to show you how our kits are set up. We have all of your background fabrics, all your fabrics to make your truck, your borders, your sashing, your binding. And I'll give you a little close-up view of our block kits. We give you a color photo of the fabrics that we've used in the block. We tell you specifically what page it's on, what size block you'll be making, and then you have a pack of fabric to make that month's block. And then each time you'll save the scraps from that month's block to use in some of the future blocks to increase your variety a little bit. So that's how they're packaged. So it helps you stay really organized, helps you tackle just a few blocks at a time. So we do have fabric packs available for those. And all of the blocks that you saw today were out of Lori Holt's Farm Girl Vintage 2. And all of the products that you see are available on our website at prairiepointjunction.com. Thanks so much for joining us.